Welcome to No Suits, No Slides, and we are here today with a couple of very special guests to talk a little bit more about some ESG topics. I'm Dave Gilbertson, Vice President at UKG, here with John Frehse, Senior Managing Director here at Ankura. Tom Crawford, Shawn Miles, if you guys can introduce yourselves as well.
Sure. Tom Crawford, I'm the Chief Development Officer at Ankura, and I also lead our global advisory practice, which focuses a lot on these issues for companies.
And I'm Shawn Miles, Senior Managing Director at Ankura, focusing on ESG and public policy.
So we spent a lot of time in the last session talking about ESG topics and kind of the core challenges around ESG, why this is a topic that's keeping CEOs up at night pretty consistently these days. Right over the last 18 months or so, this is a topic that's just exploded. We didn't talk at all about what to do about it.
Right.
We get criticism for that,
That's
by the way.
a critical missing piece right there. So, Shawn, one of the things I've heard you talk about, which I think is really interesting, is just the importance of engaging on these topics early. Instead of waiting for a time of crisis to hit, start engaging early. We go a little bit deeper there. What companies can do to start that engagement?
Well, it's twofold. It is important. One is engaging your employees and figuring out how to do that and how to have those conversations and the importance of those conversations. Many companies are dealing with right now whether, how do I get my employees returned back to the office, and should it be full-time or part-time, and some of them are not actually engaging the employees about that, right? And so that's just a fundamental piece, but particularly when it comes to the social issues, because your employees obviously are people in society and they have their perspectives. And then what are you doing to engage the community? Do you actually have relationships with community leaders, local community leaders in where you operate? And if you're national or global, looking at those national organizations and others, are you actively engaging them? Do they know who you are? Mm-hmm. Do you show up? Do you have a presence at their conferences? Do you know what their agenda is mm-hmm. on these very sensitive and important social issues? And have you shown a real interest in them? Mm-hmm. And it is not just simply philanthropy or CSR. It is not just writing the check, because obviously those organizations would need the financial support, but they actually need to know that you care and you're interested mm-hmm. and you want to help. And so setting up those relationships, and I worked with organizations that we learned the hard way that we needed to do that after we faced crisis, and then over time we started building those relationships. And so then when crisis started to come later down the road, we were better positioned to deal with them because we had allies in the community that could vouch for us being a good company by our deeds, mm-hmm. Let alone our words. The PR statement is not enough, or the Twitter statement is not enough. You really need to have validators who could really say that you're the good company, rather than you having to say that. But you actually have to be that good company.
Sure, right.
So that's a key piece of it.
It's not okay to be a good person just not practicing.
Right.
It's also interesting, like how do you spend corporate dollars effectively if you don't deeply understand the problems? And so one of the things you said is it's important to talk to the people that are actually grappling with these problems every day, and you're going to spend your dollars more effectively in your local communities.
That's
which
right.
I think is interesting.
And it doesn't require a lot of money to have that conversation, right? But it does require being somewhat introspective and open to, what is it that is really the issue, and then thinking about what can my organization do to address this challenge. And yes, writing the check is part of it, potentially be part of it, but there are many, products and services that companies have that could be of real value to addressing some of these challenges. And it's not until you have that engagement and dialogue that you can actually figure out what some of those things are, and being open to some programmatic efforts to help in this regard. And so, what I found is that organizations that do that, they get the benefit of actually getting feedback from their employees and communities about what their products and services are doing in the community, but also they're more informed about how to address some of the concerns that the community and society faces, and so that when social issues and other issues start to pop up, they're better positioned because they already have that connection. They already have that stickiness because they made this a part of how they operate as a business and operate in society.
Shockingly, they're able to hire and retain better talent because of all of this. You know,
Who would have thought?
God forbid, you know, they get these other benefits as well.
Yes.
Well, I think the other key thing is that tying these efforts to your business interests is okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it is important that businesses align what they do, where their expertise is, where their people are engaged with the sort of impact they want to make. You know, I'll give you an example. I had a large financial services client who went to Davos and agreed to fund, you know, or help fund the planting of 1 trillion trees globally. And that's great, but they're shocked when they get no credit for that with any of these groups. You know, that's not something that is going to buy you ESG, bona fides with activism. You know, they want to know, what are you doing in the world that you control? And by the way, I think if you do it the right way, you are, advancing your business, because you're talking to consumers, you're talking to people who are going to regulate you, you're talking to, all of these forces, your investors and shareholders and the people that rate you. Don't be afraid to make it part of the business plan. I think companies look at this as a separate sort of activity, and I think there's a risk when they get disconnected, from their business in terms of trying to take credit for these things. And I think it's also bad when they start stretching. I'm aware of a Canadian private equity fund that said, geez, we'd like to get sustainability credit when we don't invest in a company that's got a bad carbon footprint, for example. that is not going to earn you points with the world that's out there. What can we do that's tangible? What can we do that aligns with our business mission, what our shareholders want, what our employees want to see? And that's going to create real momentum, I think. And it gets easy, and it gets profitable, and it gets earnings per share for companies. This is not a loser.
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic. Let's go a little bit deeper here, because it used to be that this was seen as just a very fluffy, even if it's the right thing to do, we'll kind of do it, but it's put in this charitable bucket, right? We're going to do it because it's a good thing for the community, but it doesn't really have a business impact. Now all of a sudden, these things are being tied very closely to the bottom line. So what can companies do to, from both of you, to tie, all of a sudden tie these activities directly to the bottom line, whether it's to avoid taking a hit when things really hit the fan, or to actually get out in front of it? What can they do?
So I think, one of the things they should be doing is coming up, if they don't already have one, a real community engagement strategy that's beyond a philanthropic strategy, and figuring out, how they can best support the needs of the community, and how they can tie that, as Tom was saying, to what their business model is about, right? And so if you're in healthcare, there are healthcare issues in the community, and there may be products and services that, or training or education, et cetera, that you can tie to address the needs in the community. If you're in financial services, there are financial issues in the community. How do you tie that and make that part of what you're about? I think that's a key element. The other piece is, and what we haven't really talked about, is what are you doing internally within your organization? Many organizations have grappled with the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yep.
And some have hired chief diversity officers to address this challenge, and many of them have great mission and value statements around this. Yet and still, we find that many of these organizations are struggling with the representation, particularly of people of color, in management, middle management, senior management, and the board. And so how do you actively address those challenges? You have to be very intentional, and really be specific about what you're trying to accomplish, because if you don't, you may get all of this recognition because you're listed in this magazine or that publication because of your efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the reality is, those folks who don't feel like they're being represented or not actually being represented in a company don't actually validate that that's true. And the experience is such that it could cause them and the organization a lot of concern and trouble down the road. And so how do you address that directly? And so you have to be very intentional, and that's some of the things that we kind of help organizations with in terms of how you address that, both internally, in terms of addressing these issues, but also externally as well.
I think that's going to be one of the hardest things for companies to do going forward. It's one that dovetails very closely with technology. We've seen a lot in the human capital space, a lot of artificial intelligence for recruiting software as an example, where you can actually train the algorithm to identify who's been successful in this role, and so therefore more people like this are going to be successful in this role. In a lot of cases, it's done the exact opposite of what you would hope. It's reinforced that young, very well-educated white guys are the only ones that can do this job. And all of a sudden, you're losing that diversity of perspective, you're losing the voice, and it's completely unintentional, right? It's best intent from
But the
the
math
software company.
self-perpetuates.
But it self-perpetuates in a way that I don't think anyone had foreseen, and so that's where all of a sudden you got to be really careful with the way you deploy technology, because it can have some of these unintended consequences, and you lose that voice that you're talking about.
I do want to put it back on you a little bit, because at UKG, you're known for time and attendance, and that's not all that you do. And your president recently said it's not enough to capture time. We have to do more, and we do more. Can you, you're the moderator, but I'm putting it back
absolutely.
on you.
Yeah, so we have seen this up close where so I'll give you one example. We had a company, a client of ours outside the U.S. a few years ago. Their managers, they had a lot of immigrants that were in the employee population. Their managers were kind of shaving 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, figuring, there's not a whole lot that their employee base could do about it. Kind of the equivalent of a 60 Minutes type news program found out about it and profiled it. All of a sudden, they're being hauled in front of, in front of their parliament and having to answer for these awful, awful practices. And so we could go in there and sure give them time clocks where you gotta, have a thumbprint to clock in and clock out, and the company could now prove for sure that there was no funny business going on with their time. But it was very quickly clear that that is not nearly enough, right? You've got to have a much more comprehensive strategy. We recently purchased a company called Best Places to Work. That's kind of the tip of the spear in terms of that strategy of thinking a lot more robustly about some of these topics, because you do have to have a community engagement strategy. You've got to have a solid recruiting strategy to know that you're effectively getting the candidates that are going to give you a diversity of perspective and a diversity of employee base. You've got to have more of a mentoring strategy when you're figuring out your performance management, so that you're getting a broader array of perspectives that are actually being mentored at the junior levels to get up to the middle manager levels, to get up to the senior executives, and all of a sudden then they're in the position to be the next generation of leadership. One of the things that we've seen, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, is if you're not embracing these topics, do you want to train the next generation of your executives, or are you going to train the next generation of your competitors' executives? Because
Well,
if you don't take this seriously, they're going to hire them.
Right, and I had on behalf of a client on a contentious issue, had a conversation with a leader of an NGO who said, what we are at war with is enough. Mm-hmm. Companies want to just do enough. What we want is a culture of more. We want companies to do more, than just enough. And I really think, if that resonates with you and you're listening to this, that tends to be how companies are thinking about these issues. And it really is, a culture shift that needs to happen to how do we get to be a company that's doing more than a company that's just doing enough.
Yeah.
And it turns out writing the check isn't enough anyway, but
Right.
they think it's enough. But
Right.
those that want to do more are digging into the stuff that Shawn and you spent so much time working on.
So Tom, last time you kind of introduced this topic around, you said from your lobbying days, there was kind of the general rule of thumb, meet with someone 10 times before asking for anything. It feels like it dovetails very nicely with what Shawn was saying earlier. Say a little bit more about that and how you think about that.
Yeah, I think that there's a belief in these communities that they are only engaged when there's some sort of a crisis, or the company's being hit by either an activist or a shareholder saying, geez, this is really not good, or there's news, or they're going to Capitol Hill and they're worried about having some cover. And I think these groups kind of are starting to understand who's authentically engaged with them. And by the way, some industries do it easier. Tech and some new economy businesses are much more focused. They've got employees that want to do those things. But for the most part, the frustration that we hear when we're called to try to help a company is, well, where have they been?
Yeah.
And so, the idea is, one, you've got to engage. Shawn lays it out. Meet the people in your communities, not just the national leadership. There's a frustration there too.
Sure.
The local
Sure.
folks are saying, hey, rubber hits the road on the ground. The second part of it is, real action. Putting the resources into things that the community says that they want. Shawn and I talk about this all the time. It is about, what do you want? How should we do it? Letting these folks inform, the strategies and the policies and where the resources are going to go, super important. And, again, build something together, and then you've got an ability to have some, cover when you need it. And by the way, it's not inappropriate to celebrate the successes that you have together. Giving the wins to these groups is super important. It isn't, oh geez, big company X came in and look at what we did in this community. It's like, no, look at what these folks in the community, they had a vision, they sought a partnership out, and they executed this. You get so far when you credit share for these things, or let those groups, have the moment of we've made progress and celebrate that. So it really is think of it as building capital, making deposits in the bank all of the time. We don't want to take a lot of withdrawals from that, but there's going to be the occasional moment where somebody makes a mistake, there's a reputational issue, Congress wants to haul you up to a hearing. They need to hear from important groups that they care about that what you do matters, that you shouldn't be judged based on this thing because they have built a track record. And again, the one thing I will say in every issue I'm involved in, no company has the ability to claim on its own and validate itself that they're doing the right thing. So, creating that echo chamber, building capital, having a track record. And by the way, to me, it's competitive advantage. It's mitigating risk. It is, creating value, for the company. It is, positioning, for the future. And so, all of those things, who would sit in a board meeting and disagree with those things is elemental to what we're doing. Right. It shouldn't just be, well, we did enough. We checked a box. We got our rating. That I think is short-sighted and not sustainable.
And Tom and I worked on one of these issues with a financial services firm that I used to work with. And so we developed the programmatic work, working with these community leaders in collaboration with them. They owned it. We're delivering it with them to the community. They have full ownership. It's real collaboration. And so, we both feel good about what we're doing. But then some of the benefits of that is when issues started to come our way and criticism on other issues, those organizations kind of stepped up and said, how can we help? We understand that you're facing this issue. Tell us what it's about. And they brokered discussions with some of our.
But you had done real and meaningful work with them before.
Before that.
A real plan, real relationship.
And some of the intangibles but go a long way is one of the community leaders has said to me, there's a new member of Congress that just came into Congress, and we had a briefing with them, and they said, well, what are your concerns? And they said, look, these are our concerns. And also, we're doing this great work with MasterCard, or financial services company that I work with, and they were like, we want to make sure you don't do anything that damages that effort.
That's great.
Right, and that was not something we said or suggested that they say, but they actually said, you know what, this is important, and we want to make sure this work is not disrupted. And that goes a long way because you actually have advocates that are speaking for you based on their experience, and it's not something that you're paying for,
right,
or that you're actually saying that has to happen. And so I think there's so much more that companies can do if they actually actively engage.
It sounds to me like you both are saying we can spend money more effectively, more wisely for the business, but more effectively for the community. We can engage in a real and meaningful way. I remember in the 80s, all the big banks in New York, I'm a New Yorker, and I won't mention any names, but everybody who worked at a big bank had a t-shirt that had their big bank name on it and small writing at the bottom. It's like Habitat for Humanity Day, October 3rd, whatever.
Right.
And they'd go build houses for a day once a year, and then everybody was able to talk about it all year. And I can tell you, it was not real or meaningful, and mostly it was a great time to have coffee and have a day off from work.
So that's a good contrast, because what we were talking about earlier is tying what you do in ESG directly to your company, and what you do as a company, very different than what you're describing, John, right? Which is
these people aren't home builders.
That's right.
But they can help with financial strategy in those communities.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, I just think there's a difference between philanthropy and your ESG program. And it doesn't mean that they're always disconnected, but you shouldn't view philanthropy as solving my ESG issues.
Right.
And that's the core. This should be just like a business line or part of the business planning and execution and strategy. because we're not going back to a world where this stuff doesn't matter. The other thing that I've seen is you get progress not just in business but in politics and regulation. I look at the closed loop economy in Europe. The plastics manufacturers were having a really tough time with the end of single-use plastic and how do we get to a reasonable outcome? How do we keep essential things versus non-essential things? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until they partnered with an NGO, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in Europe, that they were able to get a compromise done, because the NGO was sitting there saying, here's the reasonable outcome. This is real progress if we can get there, but we have to let these guys survive. And it changed the whole debate because they had a real partner that was on the advocacy side, the activism side, saying, look, we've gotten together, we've come up with what's doable, versus putting out a press release saying by 2035 we'll reduce this stuff by whatever. That's not winning.
Airplanes are going to be powered by solar.
Right. It's just a new pathway, and it doesn't mean you can't do what you do and continue to have some reasonable successes. It's just going to be harder, and I think your competition is going to start to lap you because they're going to get more freedom to operate, more permission, less regulation, more incentives for the types of things that align with the societal value piece.
I think that's a great way to bring this all full circle, right? We started out by talking about the issues and the fact that all of a sudden expectations have raised. I think we're all of the unanimous conclusion that that's not going to change anytime soon. This has been a fascinating conversation. Tom, Shawn, Thank you so much for joining us. John, let's do it again.
Yeah, no, thanks very much to everybody. Get ready for the next one.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.